In a blistering Supreme Court clash, Justice Amy Coney Barrett unleashes sharp critiques on Attorney General Pam Bondi, aiming to unravel her case. But Bondi's fierce intellect ignites a legal firestorm that stuns the court. The air in the Supreme Court chamber was thick with anticipation as the justices settled into their seats, the weight of a pivotal federalism case hanging over them. The case, a high-stakes battle over the balance of power between states and the federal government, had drawn national attention, with Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi leading the charge for the states. Known for her prosecutorial tenacity and conservative fire, Bondi stood at the lectern, her posture resolute, her eyes scanning the bench. Across from her sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the court's newest member, whose incisive questioning and textualist rigor had already earned her a reputation as a formidable force. The case centered on a federal regulation that states argued encroached on their sovereignty, a dispute that cut to the heart of constitutional principles. Bondi's opening was measured but bold, framing the state's position as a defense of the 10th Amendment's promise of reserved powers. She cited Prince versus United States and New York versus United States, weaving a narrative of federal overreach that resonated with the originalist leanings of several justices. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms, but there was an undercurrent of caution. She knew the bench, particularly Barrett, would not let her arguments go unchallenged. Barrett leaned forward, her pen poised, her expression unreadable. When Bondi paused, Barrett struck, her voice calm but cutting. "General Bondi, your reliance on Prince assumes a clear line between federal and state authority, but how do you reconcile that with the necessary and proper clause? Isn't your position effectively nullifying Congress's ability to act within its enumerated powers?" The question was a surgical jab, designed to expose any fragility in Bondi's reasoning. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Barrett was not here to play soft. Bondi's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't flinch. She adjusted her stance, her response immediate and precise. "Justice Barrett, Prince doesn't negate Congress's powers. It reinforces that the federal government cannot conscript states into enforcing its mandates. The necessary and proper clause isn't a blank check. It's tethered to enumerated powers, and this regulation oversteps." Her tone was respectful but firm, a prosecutor's edge cutting through. She cited McCulloch versus Maryland to bolster her point, deftly turning Barrett's question into an opportunity to double down. Barrett wasn't done. "But, General, your reading of McCulloch seems selective. The court there emphasized flexibility in federal authority. Are you suggesting states can simply opt out when they disagree?" The question was sharper now, almost accusatory, and the room felt the shift. Barrett's gaze locked onto Bondi, as if daring her to falter. The other justices watched closely. Thomas scribbled notes, Kagan tilted her head, and Roberts's expression remained inscrutable. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed steady. "With respect, Justice Barrett, McCulloch supports means end scrutiny, not unchecked federal power. The regulation here isn't a necessary means. It's a coercive end that tramples state autonomy." She pivoted to Bond v. United States, citing its limits on federal overreach, her argument gaining momentum. The gallery leaned in, sensing the intensity of the exchange. Bondi wasn't just holding her ground, she was pushing back. Barrett's lips pursed slightly, a rare tell. She pressed further, her tone now carrying a hint of skepticism. "You're asking us to draw a bright line, General, but constitutional history is messy. What's to stop your framework from unraveling federal authority entirely?" The question was a gauntlet, a challenge to Bondi's entire case. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. Bondi paused, not out of hesitation, but to let the weight of Barrett's words settle. Then, with a spark in her eyes, she leaned into the lectern, her voice rising with conviction. "Justice Barrett, the line isn't mine, it's the Constitution's. The 10th Amendment exists to prevent exactly what this regulation does: federal overreach that suffocates state sovereignty. She launched into a detailed analysis of Alden versus Maine, her command of precedent unyielding. The room was electric. Bondi wasn't just answering, she was rewriting the narrative. As the clock ticked down, Barrett scribbled something, her expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity. The other justices exchanged glances, sensing a shift. Bondi's responses weren't just surviving Barrett's onslaught, they were reshaping the debate. But Barrett wasn't finished, and her next question loomed, promising to test Bondi's mettle even further. The Supreme Court chamber crackled with tension as Justice Amy Coney Barrett prepared her next salvo, her pen pausing mid-note. Pam Bondi stood firm at the lectern, her earlier responses still echoing, each one a deft counter to Barrett's probing. The justices' glances darted between the two women, the air heavy with the stakes of their intellectual duel. Bondi's command of precedent had shifted the room's dynamic, but Barrett's curiosity now carried a sharper edge, signaling she was ready to escalate. Barrett's voice cut through the silence, deliberate and measured. "General Bondi, you lean heavily on the 10th Amendment, but your argument seems to sidestep the Supremacy Clause. If states can resist federal law as you propose, doesn't that undermine the Constitution's core structure?" The question was a trap, layered with constitutional nuance, designed to force Bondi into a corner. The gallery stirred, sensing Barrett's intent to reclaim control. Justice Gorsuch leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, while Justice Sotomayor scribbled furiously. Bondi's expression remained steely, but her mind raced. Barrett's question wasn't just a challenge, it was an attempt to paint her as a radical, threatening the Union's foundation. She took a measured breath, her voice steady but infused with conviction. "Justice Barrett, the Supremacy Clause governs valid federal law, not overreach. The regulation here exceeds Congress's authority, as Murphy v. NCAA makes clear. States aren't resisting, they're asserting their constitutional role." Her citation was surgical, her tone a blend of deference and defiance. She pivoted to Gibbons v. Ogden, framing federal power as limited by its own terms. Barrett's eyes flickered, a hint of surprise betraying her composure. "But Murphy dealt with sports betting, General, not broad regulatory schemes. Are you arguing for a categorical limit on federal authority, regardless of context?" The question was relentless, Barrett's voice now carrying a prosecutorial edge. The room felt smaller, the clash tightening like a vice. Justice Kavanaugh shifted, in his seat, his pen tapping lightly, while Chief Justice Roberts's gaze locked onto Bondi, unreadable but intense. Bondi didn't hesitate, her response swift and layered. "Justice Barrett, Murphy isn't about context, it's about principle. The anti-commandeering doctrine protects states from federal coercion, whether it's betting or regulation. The Supremacy Clause doesn't erase the 10th Amendment. They coexist." She wove in Seminole Tribe versus Florida, her voice rising slightly, commanding the room. The gallery was riveted, some spectators leaning forward, others whispering. Bondi wasn't just answering, she was building a fortress of precedent. Barrett pressed harder, her tone now tinged with impatience. "You're asking for a rigid framework, General, but constitutional law thrives on flexibility. How does your approach avoid paralyzing federal governance?" The question was a direct challenge to Bondi's vision, implying her argument risked chaos. Justice Thomas's brow furrowed while Justice Kagan's lips pursed, her pen pausing. The courtroom's pulse quickened, every ear straining for Bondi's response. Bondi leaned into the lectern, her eyes locked on Barrett. "With respect, Justice Barrett, flexibility doesn't mean federal dominance. My framework respects the Constitution's design, shared power, not federal supremacy unchecked. United States versus Lopez drew that line, and this regulation crosses it." Her voice carried a prosecutor's fire, each word deliberate, her citation of Lopez a calculated strike. She paused, letting her point land, then added, "The states aren't paralyzing governance. They're preserving liberty." The room buzzed, the emotional weight of her words palpable. Barrett's pen tapped once, her expression unyielding but intrigued. She shifted tactics, her voice softer but no less piercing. "General, your passion for state sovereignty is clear. But what's the limiting principle? Could states invoke your framework to defy any federal law they dislike?" The question was a scalpel, probing for weakness in Bondi's logic. The other justices leaned in, sensing the stakes escalating. Justice Alito's eyes narrowed, while Justice Breyer scribbled, his head tilted. Bondi's heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. She knew Barrett was testing her depth, pushing her to define the boundaries of her argument. "Justice Barrett, the limit is the Constitution itself. States can't defy valid federal law, but they can resist overreach, as Bond v. United States affirms. This isn't defiance, it's accountability." Her voice was firm, her citation seamless, her argument a tightrope walk of principle and pragmatism. The gallery held its breath, the tension almost unbearable. As Barrett prepared to respond, her expression shifted again, a mix of respect and determination. The courtroom braced for the next exchange, sensing that Bondi's resilience was forcing Barrett to rethink her approach. But the clock was ticking, and Barrett's next move promised to push Bondi to her limits. The Supreme Court chamber pulsed. With anticipation, every eye on Justice Amy Coney Barrett as she leaned forward, her gaze locked on Pam Bondi. The air crackled with the intensity of their ongoing duel, Bondi's unyielding responses having forced a flicker of respect into Barrett's demeanor. Yet Barrett's determination burned brighter, her next question poised to test Bondi's endurance in this high-stakes federalism case. The justices, sensing a pivotal moment, sat alert, their pens poised, while the gallery held its collective breath. Barrett's voice was calm but laced with steel. "General Bondi, your framework hinges on state resistance to federal overreach. But what happens when states abuse that power? Doesn't your approach risk empowering states to undermine federal protections, like civil rights?" The question was a masterstroke, shifting the battlefield to a moral plane, challenging Bondi to defend her position without appearing callous. Justice Sotomayor's eyes sharpened, while Justice Gorsuch scribbled, his expression unreadable. Bondi felt the weight of the question, its implications threatening to cast her as an apologist for state overreach. She steadied herself, her voice, measured but resolute. "Justice Barrett, my framework doesn't grant states unchecked power. It demands constitutional fidelity. The 14th Amendment ensures federal protections like civil rights remain sacrosanct. Shelby County v. Holder clarified that states can't evade those obligations." Her citation was precise, her tone a careful balance of conviction and restraint. She pivoted to Katzenbach v. Morgan, reinforcing federal authority over rights violations. Barrett wasn't swayed, her tone sharpening. "But, General, Shelby invalidated part of the Voting Rights Act, empowering states. Your reliance on it suggests states can challenge federal oversight broadly. Where's the line?" The question was a dagger, implying Bondi's argument could unravel decades of progress. Justice Kagan leaned forward, her pen pausing, while Chief Justice Roberts's gaze intensified, probing Bondi's resolve. The gallery murmured, the stakes palpable. Bondi's pulse quickened, but her expression remained composed. "Justice Barrett, Shelby struck a balance, not a blank check. States can assert sovereignty within constitutional bounds, but they can't override federal protections. The line is clear. The Constitution's text and structure, as City of Bourne v. Flores underscores." Her voice grew firmer, her citation a shield against Barrett's thrust. She leaned into the lectern, her eyes meeting Barrett's. "This case isn't about dismantling rights. It's about preserving the federal-state balance." Barrett's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak of balance, General, but your framework tilts heavily toward states. How do you address the practical chaos of states cherry-picking federal laws to ignore?" The question was unrelenting, Barrett's voice now carrying a prosecutorial edge. Justice Thomas's pen stopped, his brow furrowing, while Justice Alito tilted his head, intrigued. The courtroom's tension was electric, every word a spark. Bondi didn't blink, her response immediate and forceful. "Justice Barrett, states don't get to cherry-pick, courts do. My framework empowers judicial review to enforce constitutional limits, as United States v. Morrison demonstrates. The chaos you fear comes from federal overreach, not state resistance." Her voice carried a prosecutor's fire, her citation a calculated strike. She paused, letting her words sink in, then added, "The Constitution trusts courts to hold the line, and this court has done so for centuries." Barrett's pen tapped. Once, a subtle sign of her recalculating. "Yet Morrison limited federal power, not state power, General. Are you arguing for a judiciary that polices only Congress, leaving states unchecked?" The question was a curveball, designed to expose any inconsistency in Bondi's logic. Justice Breyer's eyes flickered with interest, while Justice Kavanaugh's expression hardened, his pen moving swiftly. The gallery leaned in, sensing the confrontation nearing a breaking point. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Justice Barrett, Morrison policed both. Congress for overreach, states for compliance. My framework isn't a free pass for states. It's a call for constitutional clarity, rooted in Prince and New York. Courts check everyone." Her response was a masterclass in precision, her citations weaving a tight argument. The room buzzed, spectators whispering, some nodding. Bondi wasn't just surviving, she was commanding. As Barrett prepared her next question, her expression flickered with a mix of admiration and resolve. The justices exchanged subtle glances, sensing Bondi's arguments were reshaping the case's trajectory. But Barrett's gaze hardened, signaling she had one more challenge up her sleeve. One that could push Bondi to the edge. The Supreme Court chamber buzzed with unspoken tension, the weight of Pam Bondi's relentless arguments hanging in the air. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, her expression a mix of grudging respect and steely resolve, poised herself for another strike, her eyes fixed on Bondi at the lectern. The justices' subtle glances betrayed their growing intrigue. Bondi's mastery of constitutional precedent was tilting the case's momentum. Yet Barrett's hardened gaze signaled she was far from finished. Her next question a coiled spring, ready to test Bondi's limits in this defining federalism battle. Barrett's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and deliberate. "General Bondi, your framework relies on courts to check both state and federal power. But what happens when courts disagree? Doesn't your approach invite a patchwork of rulings that destabilizes national unity?" The question was a calculated blow, probing not just Bondi's logic but its real-world consequences. Justice Kagan's pen paused, her eyes narrowing, while Justice Gorsuch leaned back, his expression inscrutable. The gallery stirred, sensing Barrett's intent to unravel Bondi's carefully built case. Bondi's heart raced, but her face remained a mask of composure. Barrett's question was a minefield, threatening to paint her as an architect of judicial chaos. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but charged. "Justice Barrett, courts have always disagreed. That's why this court exists. My framework doesn't create a patchwork. It demands fidelity to the Constitution's text, as Marbury v. Madison established. Uniformity comes from principle, not federal fiat." Her citation was a deft parry, her tone resolute. She wove in Martin v. Hunter's lessee, reinforcing the court's role in resolving disputes. Barrett's eyes flickered, but her tone grew colder. Marbury is foundational, General, but it doesn't answer the practical problem. Your framework emboldens states to challenge federal law, risking endless litigation. How is that not a recipe for disorder? The question was relentless, Barrett's voice now carrying a hint of accusation. Justice Thomas's brow furrowed while Justice Sotomayor scribbled, her lips pursed. The courtroom's pulse quickened, the clash tightening its grip. Bondi didn't waver, her response swift and incisive. Justice Barrett, litigation isn't disorder, it's democracy. States challenging overreach, as in NFIB versus Sebelius, ensure accountability. The alternative, unquestioned federal power, risks tyranny. Her voice carried a prosecutor's edge, her citation a precise strike. She paused, her eyes meeting Barrett's. This court's role is to clarify, not suppress, as Youngstown Sheet and Tube affirmed. The gallery buzzed, spectators whispering, some nodding in awe. Bondi was turning Barrett's challenge into a rallying cry. Barrett's pen tapped once, her expression unyielding. But NFIB upheld federal power in part, General. You're cherry-picking. Precedents to suit your narrative. Where's the principled limit to state defiance? The question was a scalpel, cutting at Bondi's credibility. Justice Alito tilted his head, intrigued, while Justice Breyer's pen moved swiftly, his eyes sharp. The room felt smaller, the confrontation a high-wire act with no margin for error. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice remained firm. Justice Barrett, NFIB limited federal coercion, not state rights. My principle is simple. The Constitution's enumerated powers, as United States versus Butler clarified. States defy nothing. They uphold their role. Her citation was seamless, her argument a fortress. She leaned into the lectern, her voice rising slightly. The limit isn't defiance. It's the text itself, which this court has guarded since McCulloch. The room was electric, her words resonating with conviction. Barrett shifted tactics, her tone softer but no less piercing. You speak of text, General, but constitutional interpretation evolves. Your rigid originalism ignores modern complexities. How does it address today's interconnected world? The question was a curveball, challenging Bondi's philosophy itself. Justice Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed, while Chief Justice Roberts's gaze intensified, probing Bondi's depth. The gallery leaned in, sensing the stakes soaring. Bondi's pulse pounded, but her composure held. Justice Barrett, originalism isn't rigid. It's rooted. The Constitution's principles, as District of Columbia versus Heller shows, adapt without bending. This case isn't about complexity. It's about power's limits. Her voice was a blend of fire and precision, her citation a shield. The justices exchanged glances, some visibly impressed. Bondi wasn't just holding ground. She was reshaping the debate's contours. As Barrett prepared to counter, her expression flickered with a hint of admiration, but her eyes gleamed with resolve. The courtroom braced for her next move, sensing Bondi's brilliance was forcing a reckoning. But the clock was merciless, and Barrett's final question loomed, promising to push Bondi to her breaking point. The Supreme Court chamber was a crucible of tension, the air thick with the clash between Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Attorney General Pam Bondi. Barrett's eyes, gleaming with resolve, betrayed a flicker of admiration for Bondi's relentless precision, but her posture signaled she was ready to deliver a final, piercing challenge. The justices, their pens poised, exchanged glances, aware that Bondi's intellectual prowess was reshaping this pivotal federalism case. The gallery held its breath, the clock ticking down as Barrett prepared to push Bondi to her limits. Barrett's voice was steady, but its edge was unmistakable. General Bondi, your originalist framework claims to anchor the Constitution's limits, but what about its silences? Where the text is ambiguous, as in commerce or general welfare, Doesn't your approach leave states free to exploit gaps at the federal government's expense? The question was a masterstroke, probing the heart of Bondi's philosophy, daring her to navigate the Constitution's gray areas. Justice Sotomayor's eyes sharpened, while Justice Gorsuch scribbled, his face unreadable. Bondi felt the question's weight, its implications threatening to cast her as an enabler of constitutional anarchy. She steadied herself, her voice calm, but resolute. Justice Barrett, the Constitution's silences aren't loopholes. They're boundaries. Where ambiguity exists, United States versus Lopez and United States versus Morrison guide courts to preserve the federal-state balance. States don't exploit. They assert their reserved powers. Her citation was razor-sharp, her tone a blend of deference and defiance. She wove in Gibbons versus Ogden, reinforcing limits on federal overreach. Barrett's gaze tightened, her tone growing sharper. But Lopez and Morrison constrained Congress, not states, General. Your reliance on them dodges the question. What stops states from abusing ambiguity to defy federal authority? The question was a blade, accusing Bondi of sidestepping the issue. Justice Kagan leaned forward, her pen still, while Justice Thomas's brow furrowed, his eyes locked on Bondi. The courtroom's tension was palpable, every word a spark in a powder keg. Bondi's pulse quickened, but her composure held firm. Justice Barrett, states are checked by the Constitution's structure, courts, federal powers, and the people. Bond v. United States clarified that ambiguity doesn't grant states a blank check. It demands judicial scrutiny. This case tests federal overreach, not state defiance. Her voice carried a prosecutor's fire, her citation a shield. She paused, her eyes meeting Barrett's. The system works because no one, state or federal, is above the text. Barrett pressed harder, her voice now tinged with skepticism. You trust courts to resolve ambiguity, General, but judicial restraint often favors states. Doesn't your framework tilt the scales, undermining federal governance in a globalized world? The question was relentless, challenging Bondi's vision as outdated. Justice Alito tilted his head, intrigued, while Justice Breyer scribbled furiously, his expression intense. The gallery murmured, sensing the confrontation nearing. A climax. Bondi leaned into the lectern, her voice steady but charged. Justice Barrett, judicial restraint doesn't favor states. It favors the Constitution. Prince v. United States and New York versus United States ensure courts check federal overreach, not enable state supremacy. Global or not, the text governs. Her citation was a calculated strike, her argument a fortress. She added, "This isn't about tilting scales, it's about upholding the framers' design." The room buzzed, spectators whispering, some nodding in awe. Bondi was commanding the narrative. Barrett's pen tapped once, her expression a mix of respect and determination. Yet the framers didn't foresee today's complexities, General. Your strict textualism risks paralyzing federal responses to modern crises. How do you reconcile that? The question was a curveball, probing Bondi's adaptability. Justice Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed, while Chief Justice Roberts's gaze intensified, unyielding. The gallery leaned in, the stakes soaring as the clock ticked mercilessly. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice remained unwavering. Justice Barrett, the framers built a flexible system, not a federal monolith. McCulloch v. Maryland allows adaptation within enumerated powers, but this regulation exceeds them, as Murphy v. Ciancio confirms. Textualism isn't paralysis, it's principle. Her response was a masterclass in precision, her citations weaving a seamless argument. The justices exchanged glances, some visibly impressed. Bondi wasn't just surviving, she was redefining the debate. As Barrett prepared her final retort, her eyes softened slightly, a hint of acknowledgement in her gaze. The courtroom braced for the climax, sensing Bondi's brilliance had shifted the dynamic. But the session was nearing its end, and the justice's next move would determine whether Bondi's arguments would cement her legacy. The Supreme Court chamber thrummed with electric tension, every eye on Justice Amy Coney Barrett, as she prepared her final retort. Her softened gaze, a fleeting nod to Pam Bondi's brilliance, hardened once more, signaling one last challenge in this seismic federalism case. The justices, their expressions a mix of intrigue and anticipation, sensed Bondi's arguments had reshaped the debate. The gallery held its breath, the session's end looming, as Barrett's next words promised to test whether Bondi's legacy would endure. Barrett's voice was measured, but its edge cut deep. General Bondi, your textualism anchors the Constitution's principles, but principles alone don't govern. If we adopt your framework, how do we avoid a fractured nation where states prioritize their own interests over collective stability? The question was a thunderbolt, framing Bondi's vision as a threat to national unity. Justice Kagan's pen froze, her eyes sharp, while Justice Gorsuch leaned forward, his face inscrutable. The room felt the weight of Barrett's challenge, a final gauntlet. Bondi's heart pounded, but her composure was ironclad. Barrett's question aimed to paint her as a divisive force, yet she saw an opening. She leaned into the lectern, her voice steady and resolute. Justice Barrett, the Constitution doesn't fracture, it unites. My framework, rooted in Prince v. United States and New York v. United States, ensures states and the federal government share power, not compete. Stability comes from checks, not dominance. Her citation was a masterstroke, her tone a blend of conviction and clarity. She wove in Alden v. Maine, reinforcing state sovereignty as a unifying force. Barrett's eyes, narrowed but a flicker of respect lingered. Yet Prince didn't address national crises, General. Your framework assumes states will cooperate, but history shows otherwise. What's your safeguard? The question was unrelenting, probing Bondi's pragmatism. Justice Thomas's pen paused, his brow furrowed, while Justice Sotomayor scribbled, her expression intense. The gallery murmured, sensing the confrontation's peak. Bondi didn't flinch, her response swift and incisive. Justice Barrett, the safeguard is the Constitution itself, courts, elections, and the people. United States versus Lopez and Bond versus United States empower judicial review to balance power, not break it. States aren't rogue actors, they're partners in liberty. Her voice carried a prosecutor's fire, her citations a fortress. She paused, her eyes locked on Barrett. This case isn't about division. It's about fidelity to our founding. The room buzzed, spectators whispering, some nodding in awe. Barrett leaned back, her pen still, her expression shifting to one of quiet contemplation. The other justices exchanged glances, sensing a turning point. Chief Justice Roberts broke the silence, his voice calm but probing. General Bondi, your framework implies a new test for federalism cases. Can you articulate its core principle? The question was unexpected, an invitation to crystallize her vision. The gallery leaned in, the stakes soaring. Bondi seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. Mr. Chief Justice, the core is simple. Federal power stops where state sovereignty begins, as defined by the Constitution's text and structure. McCulloch v. Maryland allows flexibility, but Murphy v. NCAA demands limits. Courts must ask, does the federal action coerce states beyond enumerated powers? If yes, it fails. Her words were a clarion call, her test a bold synthesis of precedent. The room was electric, her argument a beacon. The session ended, but the chamber's energy lingered. Weeks later, the court's decision stunned the legal world, a 6-3 ruling favoring the states, with Barrett writing the majority opinion. She adopted Bondi's framework, dubbing it the Bondi Test, a rigorous standard for federalism cases. Barrett's opinion praised Bondi's incisive, constitutional clarity, a rare nod that sent ripples through the legal community. The gallery erupted in whispers as the ruling was read, Bondi's name now etched in history. In the aftermath, Barrett and Bondi met briefly outside the court, their exchange cordial but charged. "You pushed us to think deeper, General," Barrett said, her tone genuine. Bondi smiled, her eyes steady. "The Constitution demands it, Justice." The encounter, though brief, marked a shift. Barrett's initial skepticism had given way to respect, and Bondi's brilliance had redefined her as a legal titan. The Bondi test became a cornerstone of federalism, a testament to intellectual humility and the power of principled advocacy. The legal world, once skeptical of Bondi's depth, now hailed her as a genius, while Barrett's rigor earned her new admiration for engaging Bondi as an equal. The case closed, but its legacy endured, a story of confrontation, brilliance, and triumph.